Well, here's the thing. You're paying a man a big price to do this. Back in 1870, you might pay a graphic artist $500 to do a month's work for one page of an illustration
Wow.
on a magazine. Then they started making these other cuts, and you could do the front page of a magazine for maybe $50.
That is wild. Hey guys, this is Katie with Vintage Vinyl back with another great video for you, and this is editing me realizing that I did not record an intro for this video on the world's longest yard sale, but that was because I thought, I'm just going to feature this booth in a little clip in my yard sale vlog. And after I got talking to Mr. Marty, I realized, oh my gosh, this has to be an entire video. So what's special about Marty is not only is he a fabulous seller on the yard sale, but he has worked a long time with printers blocks, printing presses, and basically the whole printers process. And he gave me a whole history lesson on printers blocks and had an incredible collection to share with you. So I hope you'll check out this video with me and learn a little something you didn't know before. Hey folks, I've met Marty here and he is fantastic. Marty, tell us a little bit about your booth. You've got some fantastic things.
Well, I call this Marty's Mementos. We produce things called a story in a box. You'll take antique printer's type, miniatures, thumbtacks, little tie-tack pins, pin back buttons, lighters, matches, everything, and you put them into a shadow box to show off a hobby or an occupation. I'm just telling you about some of the old type. You're asking ages and so forth. In colonial times, most of your picture cuts were hand-carved wood cuts. Wood cuts were produced for commercial use until about 1910. They were used heavily up to about 1880 when new processes came out in 1880. The newer processes kind of overtook the older processes by 1910, and up until the 60s and 70s, the main way that type cuts and stuff were produced were on metal. This is what's known as an electrotype. This was an Art Deco piece that was produced in the 30s, and it's actually got a thin layer of lead that has been electroplated with copper, and then it's mounted on a block of wood.
And then that would go into the printing press first.
This would go in the printing press along with little lead letters, and a roller would come down, ink to cut, paper would come over onto it, another roller would come over, make the image. Depending on what kind of a press, modern press, a puff of air would shoot that paper over. Back in Ben Franklin's day, they would actually take a dauber and daub the ink, and it was a screw press, and they lay the paper down, they pull the screw back, peel the paper off the cut, and hang it like clothing with little clothespins for the ink to dry.
Wow.
And they would have a fire burning in the print shop and keep it hot so that ink would dry pretty quick.
That's fascinating. Now, you were telling me about these. What are these?
Well, printers call these dingbats. Dingbat is basically a very small picture cut. And even in the colonial days, they had little lead letters and little lead images that were small. Especially in the older days, a lot of their picture cuts would be in silhouette. They'd have them in the period dress, like here's a little printer.
Oh my gosh, that is so cool.
And if it's printed, even though you really don't see his clothes, you can just tell by the little cuts here and there that he's a colonial printer with one of the old screw presses.
That's amazing. Now, you were telling me a little bit about how you date these, but there's no hard and fast rule, really?
There's no hard, fast rule on dating. I've had cuts that I was very comfortable to say that they were 250 years old, but to the amateur looking at it, they don't look that much different from one that's only 50 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So in general, I don't price my stuff based strictly on age. I do it more on rarity and, of course, popularity. For example, Coca-Cola is very popular. So naturally, it's a little higher. And thankfully, it's a little more common, so it's not as high as, say, some of the Walt Disney type cuts I've got. Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck did a lot of advertising over the years, so I find a lot of cuts where they're advertising Nabisco cookies and, of course, their own products. But they're very rare to find. A tight cut about this size here, this is a Prudential life insurance cut. That was $12.50. And that's because it's a zinc rather than a copper. A copper would be like $14.50. Coca-Cola that size would probably run about $18.
And is the zinc
Mickey
newer?
Mouse would probably run about $40.
Yeah. Is zinc newer than copper?
I'm sorry.
Is the zinc newer than copper?
It's newer. 1880, George Eastman, Kodak Company, they got involved in making the new processes where they're using acid etching to eat up all the stuff around it. And what then they would plate it. Usually it would be lead, and you would think this would be more expensive because you're going through the process of eating the lead with the acid, and then you're taking this lead and you're putting it in a copper bath, running electricity to it to plate the copper. But wages was so cheap compared to the metal back then in the 1880s on up to World War II that's what they usually did. Zincs were at least available by 1900, maybe earlier. Then they went to magnesium. Magnesium deteriorates a lot quicker. And zincs and magnesiums were very heavily used in the 60s and 70s, 50s. In World War II, Franklin D. Roosevelt decided that printing was so important, they didn't make copper unavailable to printers, where they did on just about anything else. It all went to the war effort. Today, you'll find some things that were made in World War II that's copper, but then right after the war, the demand for copper, for piping, and for wiring for the servicemen coming home was so great that it just became so expensive to order a copper electrotype. You could order 4 or 5 zincs
for a much better price.
For a much better price. So that's why there's so much zinc and so forth in that time period. And of course, a lead cut, they had those from colonial days all the way up, at least into the 70s. Now, in 1977, the EPA came out with regulations that put a lot of the manufacturers out of business. Of course, most of them were getting close to retirement age anyway, but they were going to have to retool to keep all that waste. Most of that lead acid waste just went down to the sewers, into the river. And EPA stopped all that, but in the process, about half of the companies went out of business.
Went out of business. Now, you said you used to go into print shops and just buy tons of printing blocks.
When they were swapping out, they went to newer processes. We used to go into print companies, and we could buy 500-600 of these trays full of cuts back then in those days. This is 40 years ago.
Wow.
The last type cuts I've purchased was about 10 years ago. There's just nobody out there anymore.
And they're becoming harder to find.
They're getting real hard to find. Hardly anybody, I don't know if anybody actually uses this for the original purpose of printing in a letterpress, with the exception of, I do know 2 part-timers that do wedding invitations, emboss, very high quality printing work, and they'll buy stuff from me because they can't find anything from anywhere else. And other than that, I don't think anybody uses this. Like I was telling you earlier, a lady came in here talking to me about printing. She does printing nowadays. She was admiring some of this old work. And I said, yeah, I'm sure all you do is get on the computer today and just type in what you need to have the machine do for you. I said, no. I said, I just sit on a stool. I say, Siri, I need font so-and-so. I need size so-and-so.
So much better than having to arrange these in the press.
Oh, yeah. In the old days, you'd have what's called a composing stick, and you'd pull out the letters and so forth and get it all fixed up in the composing stick, and then you'd put it into a chase, lock it in, make some proofs to see if you've got your letters backwards or upside down or what have you. If everything was good, you locked it into the press and went with it.
And you were telling me about the nails in blocks. I'm curious about that.
Well, for example, now this is one I haven't got cleaned up. You can see where it's been nailed on to the old block. Up until 1900, any of the metal plates would have been attached by nails. From 1900 on, most of the companies started using a contact adhesive. But when they come loose in a print shop, they didn't spray contact adhesive back. They took a hammer and nail and just nailed it back on.
So that can be confusing in the dating.
It's confusing on dating. It's really, you almost have to be in the business. Like this particular cut here. This one is advertising Weiss scissors, and it's got this Victorian lady that's doing her sewing. Just by the looks of it, the fact that it's got nails, and actually the fact that it's got certain numbers here that I can identify, this was made back in the 1890s.
And the wood's definitely older.
It's old wood, cherry wood.
And the cut's deeper, you said, right?
They're usually deeper. It's rare for the later ones to be as deep, particularly the ones that were manufactured in the 60s, 70s, 80s. I don't know about really how much the stuff looked in the 90s and 2000s, because a lot of that was actually made out of plastic. I don't have a sample to show you. They're black and ugly.
Yeah, these are cool. Do you have any other favorite things you want to show me here in your booth?
wish I had my samples. Well, here's one thing I just use. Now this is hand carved wood. That's what we call a wood cut, and it's just a star.
That is very cool.
And like I say, in the colonial days up to the 1880s, before they started coming out with this manufactured stuff, different style of manufacturing. This is the thing that they would have to do. They would hand carve this stuff. And the very last company I'm aware of that actually did, for commercial work, hand carved wood cuts went out of business in 1910.
Wow.
There were hundreds of these companies before 1880, and every year they got less and less because, well, here's the thing. You're paying a man a big price to do this. Back in 1870, you might pay a graphic artist $500 to do a month's work for one page of an illustration
Wow.
on a magazine. Then they started making these other cuts, and you could do the front page of a magazine for maybe $50.
That is wild. Such a big difference in price.
So naturally that killed off that kind of technology. Now, like I was telling you with the letters, they still manufactured those right up into the 1980s. The last company I'm aware of on that was the Hammond Company, and they made their factory into a museum, and they used to make the old printers would type. Which
And these are the ones that you're talking about over here.
Yeah.
Just individual letters.
See, in most print shops, they had little lead letters that they would use to print up everything else, but you start making up posters and stuff, it gets just awful heavy and expensive to have a big lead letter, so they would make these wood letters to print up posters and different things like that. Most people that buy these from me today, they'll glue them together and make a coffee table.
Oh, that's cool. Spell something neat out of them. Now, how old are some of these buildings, do you think?
Oh, they're over 100 years old easily.
Wow.
And this and this actually should go together. This would be printed in one color, this is printed in another color.
That,
and that's
this is
part
so
of what
fascinating.
people would have to do. They'd have to
Look at
sometimes
these.
multiple different
Wow.
cuts to have multiple different colors. These are mining cuts that were used to print up safety magazines for the coal mining industry.
Whoa. That is really neat. Look at that coal. I love that.
There's an old time mill. When this was made, which it's probably a 150-year-old type cut. When this was made, they were probably had information above and below talking about this mill and their clothing that they were producing, and it probably had an ad in there. The latest, most modern technology to make the best clothes in America.
And how old is something like this here, the skeleton key?
Okay, now this is a zinc skeleton key, and even though it's got nails on it and everything, I doubt seriously that it's older than 1920, and it's probably even around 1960. Like I say, it is nailed, but it's a good chance that was nailed at the print shop.
Sure. Man,
Particularly since it's a round head nail rather than the square nail.
I mean, all of these. Oh, look at this little guy. He's got a name. I just can't remember what his name is. The electric guy.
That is Ready Kilowatt.
Yeah, Ready Kilowatt. Do you have him on any?
Oh,
yeah, you got Ready Kilowatt.
Now here's a couple of differences. This is Ready Kilowatt. This is Willie Wirehand. Ready Kilowatt, he was the advertising mascot for years for companies that were for profit. Willie Wirehand was the advertising logo for the cooperatives, like where I live at. I have Salt River Rural Electric Cooperative. It provides me with my electricity. Whereas the guy that originally drew up this one, he drew it up for Alabama Power Company, Birmingham, Alabama.
That is so cool. Look at all of these. This is just my kind of tray over here. All these tools and individual things. Man, sir, you have quite the collection. And you did say that your dad was in printing, right?
He was a printer for 42 years. And the company he worked at, I don't know, am I allowed to say?
Sure, absolutely.
He worked for Fawcett Printing Company. Now, Fawcett is a big publishing house in Greenwich, Connecticut. They had Fawcett Comics and many different magazines and how-to books, little Fawcett paperback novels and so forth. And they wanted their own printing shop at one time. But back in the 1930s, I believe it was, C.T. Deering's is where my dad originally started at. And they wanted C.T. Deering's in Louisville, Kentucky, so they could have their own print shop. And that became Fawcett. For a while it was called Fawcett Haynes, and then just Fawcett's. And then eventually it was bought out by Worldwide Color and moved to Illinois. They folded the place up. At the time of their greatest height, they had over 1,500 people working there.
That's incredible.
Women's Day magazine, they put out monthly 1.5 million
Wow.
magazines. My dad actually worked on what's known as a rotogravure press. It uses a cylinder plate that you lock onto a cylinder, and it uses 4-color ink to make colored pictures. When he first started, back in the 30s, the comic book he was producing was Uncle Billy's Whiz Bang. And the press was maybe 10 foot long and maybe about this tall and maybe about this wide. And he was what was known as a flyboy, which jogs the books, jogs the papers together to straighten them up and get them out of the way so they can keep running more. And when he retired, or just before he became foreman, he was lead journeyman pressman on a press that was 2 blocks long, 2 stories high, and that was the one that put out the 1.5 million Women's Day a month.
Wow, that's incredible. Well, thank you for sharing this fabulous booth with us. If you guys are on the 127 yard sale route here in Lawrenceburg, Kentucky, please come find this gentleman. What field are you in? How do they find you?
I don't have the address handy to tell you, but we're about 7 miles south of the Bluegrass Parkway on 127. We're about 4 miles north of Harrodsburg, Kentucky.
Well, guys, that is it for this video. Thank you so much for coming along and learning about printer's blocks. Isn't Marty fantastic? He just started coming alive, and I had to record everything he was sharing with me because I learned so much. He was the most interesting gentleman, and I can't wait to catch him next year on the yard sale. So definitely, if you're in Lawrenceburg, Kentucky, head to the directions that he gave you. He'll be back in that field, and you can find him and shop his printer's blocks and all of his small miniatures. He's just fantastic. So, of course, give a round of applause for Marty in the comments down below of this video. And before my next video, I'll be seeing you over on Instagram at vintage_and_vinyl. And I hope, as always, folks, that you will save that vintage, spin that vinyl, and binge YouTube. Bye-bye, everyone.
What?